In the early 2000s, the games company Briar Patch put out a series of puzzles based on landscapes depicting different ecosystems found across the United States. They included a scene of a Great Plains prairie, one of a Pacific coral reef, and this one of the Arctic tundra. But look closer. That puzzle is stamps. The quality of the stamp art was probably a big part of why the Nature of America series, which started in 1999, was such a big hit with collectors, and it was a departure from how stamp art had been done in the past. Let's talk about it. The Nature of America series ended in 2010, and to celebrate the 12th and final release, the post office put out this box set. It contains one copy of each year's release, as well as a short booklet with interviews with the art director of the stamps, Ethel Kessler, and the artist himself, John Dawson. It also has some sketches Dawson did in the development of the set. As they say in the interviews, this series started out as a request from the Citizens Stamp Advisory Committee for a simple 4-stamp set to feature the flora and fauna of American deserts, similar to a release put out in 1981. This led to a sketch from Dawson focused on the Chihuahuan Desert that impressed the commission. It was similar in feel to the recently released World of Dinosaurs set, a continuous panorama that was divided up into stamps, and it led them to requesting an expansion of the idea, both for the Sonoran Desert, but also over 5 more ecosystems. Due to the popularity of the series, this eventually expanded into 12 total releases. This is the Sonoran Desert pane, the first in the series, and it's probably obvious why this was immediately popular with collectors. Unless you catch the light correctly, it can be difficult to tell that this picture is cut into stamps, and it definitely isn't the standard grid you'd find on a normal sheet of stamps. In fact, most of this pane isn't stamps at all. It's what collectors call selvage, or the printing around the actual stamps. Having designs on the selvage wasn't completely new. Mr. Zip, the mascot to promote the use of the zip code when it was introduced in 1963, lived in this area on stamp sheets for a couple of decades. This was his first appearance in 1964, but we already saw it on the Desert Plains release. There he is. But having actual artwork in the selvage related to the stamps themselves was not as common. If you look at a pane of Elvis stamps from 1993, which is quite possibly the most hyped, most collected stamp of all time, it's just a sheet of stamps. With that said, if we look at the stamp as part of the Legends of American Music series, we do see a bit more design up top, if we want to count this as design. This setup, done with a little bit more effort, also shows up in the classic collection stamps like the Legends of the West, which I have a video about here. The selvage designs get even more detailed for the Legends of Hollywood series, which started in 1995 with Marilyn Monroe. And from 1991 to 1995, the World War II souvenir sheet series had the selvage area as a major part of the design. Now, this idea wasn't invented in the 90s, but older versions of these sorts of selvage designs tended to be limited to releases for stamp exhibitions. Yes, stamp exhibitions exist, and we usually get big ones in the US every 10 years. The next one is in Boston in 2026. Anyway, the first examples of these are mostly just text commemorating the event, but they do get a little bit more creative as time goes on. The Postal Service put together this nice little design for the 1978 Canadian International Philatelic Exhibition, highlighting wildlife that the two countries share. This marks the first time the raccoon is honored on a US stamp, but it's actually not the last. The standout from these exhibition souvenir sheets came out in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial of the country, and they feature 4 famous paintings of the Revolutionary War. What's notable is that the paintings come first and the stamps second. The perforations aren't in a grid, they're spread out across the sheet where they fit best. These are legal postage. You could send a letter with these, but it's safe to assume that nearly all of these were purchased to be collected. And it probably demonstrates why this sort of format wasn't used for standard releases. If you want to get a perforated stamp off the sheet, you usually fold it back and forth and then tear it off. Looking at the Marilyn Monroe sheet, the perforations go all the way to the edge of the pane to help you do that. But it's really awkward to fold and tear the perforations on these bicentennial sheets. You'd probably need an X-Acto knife if you wanted to actually use these for a letter. You can see this on the World of Dinosaurs stamps, which I mentioned were an influence on the Nature of America series. These are 2 continuous pieces of art, but they're laid out very carefully to have all the stamps adjacent to each other on a couple of primary perforation lines. These are designed to be folded, torn, and used. Of course, perforation lines are only an issue if you have the old-fashioned style of stamps that you have to tear and lick. If you have self-adhesive stamps that you peel off a backing layer, well, you can cut those wherever you want, and they're still pretty easy to use. Luckily, self-adhesive stamps had been introduced in 1992. Actually reintroduced, but that's another video. And by the turn of the century, they became the primary type of stamp that the Postal Service released. This opened up an art-first approach for the Nature of America series without sacrificing the practical use of the stamps as actual postage. The first few releases did require the stamps to be adjacent to each other, but not on a limited number of perforation lines, and by the 5th year, they were free to cut the stamps wherever they liked. And the result were 12 different panes of stamps. Like I mentioned before, each of these panes is cut out into 10 stamps, but there's a lot more than 10 species on each one. The back of the pane goes into detail about what you find on the front. Each release had a first day of issue ceremony held in a location related to its subject. For instance, the longleaf pine forest ceremony was at the Tall Timbers Research Station just outside of Tallahassee, Florida, and the Monterey Aquarium in California actually had a couple of divers reveal the design for the kelp forest release during their first day ceremony. Since the series ended in 2010, we really haven't seen anything quite like it. We've had single sheets that highlight a collection of natural wonders, like the National Parks Anniversary release, or the Wild and Scenic Rivers sheet from 2019. We've had the Oh Beautiful set that I briefly discussed in another video, and the Earthscapes sheet from 2012. But a series of artwork as the basis for stamps, like the Nature of America set was, hasn't come around again yet. So instead, we're stuck with puzzles like this that the Postal Service sells in its online shop. Which is a bummer, because shouldn't one old person hobby like stamp collecting benefit another old person hobby like jigsaw puzzles? Whatever. Well, if you'll excuse me, I have to go tend to my stamps about gardening, crossword puzzles, and quilting. I'll see y'all later. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're into stamp memorabilia, the Postal Service put out a few sets of note cards for the Nature of America releases. Ironically, they don't come with postage.